Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webcast. My name is Christine Dorsey Davis. I'm the Executive Director of the Ohio chapter of the American Planning Association, and I am your webcast moderator. Today is Friday, March 5th, and we will hear the presentation, Suburban Design in a New Era. For technical help during today's webcast, you can type your questions in the chat box found in the GoToWebinar tool panel. For your content questions related to the presentation, go ahead and again type those in the questions box in your GoToWebinar tool panel. We will answer those at the end of the presentation during the Q&A. Our Q&A is actually going to be split up into two phases. We have some kind of pre-populated questions for our panelists that we'll run through, and then as time allows, we will fill our remaining time with questions from you all. So go ahead and type those questions in as you think of them. If it's for a particular panelist, it would help me out if you just say who it is so I don't have to try to figure that out on the fly. Coming up next on your screen is a list of our sponsoring APA chapters and divisions for 2021. Thanks to all those participating sponsors for making these webcasts possible and free to members. Today in particular, we are sponsored by the APA Illinois chapter. So thanks to you for joining us and for providing today's great lineup of panelists. Coming up next on your screen is a list of our most upcoming webcasts. We are again filling up for 2021. We're shaping up to be another great year full of really great, diverse sessions. You can register for these and all of our upcoming sessions by heading over to our webcast webpage at ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. Today's session has been approved for 1.5 CM credits for live viewing. You can log those AICP credits by heading over to planning.org and logging into your MyAPA account. And from there, you can either search by today's title or event number. Both of those can be found again on our webcast webpage, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. And be sure to head over to Facebook and like us. Just search Planning Webcast Series will pop up. That's where I post any immediate timely information like a date or time change, and also when new sessions are available for you to register. So be sure to like us on Facebook, and we record all of our sessions. So be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. We have well over 300 sessions available for you to view. So by subscribing, you'll get notified when a new session has been posted. So I think that's it for all of my housekeeping items. With that, I am going to turn it over to you, Tom, to give an introduction and to kick things off. And there, the controls are yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Christine. Just get my screen up. And of course, my slide is not coming up. I apologize.
I see it.
Oh, you do see it. Oh,
yep.
Good. Okay, perfect. Yeah, so again, my name is Tom Ferrasi. I am the Planning and Economic Development Manager with the Village of Carroll Stream in Carroll Stream, Illinois. I'm also this year's Advisory Committee Chairman for the MDRN, or the Municipal Design Review Network. We're jointly sponsoring this the webcast with Chicago Metro section. And just for those of you who might not be familiar with MDRN, since we have kind of a national group today, obviously, it is a unique network of Chicago area communities with design review boards or commissions and staff professionals, and we share our ideas and best practices kind of in the realm of suburban design review. We like to have programs and do research and kind of outreach to suburban communities so that everyone is able to talk about these crucial suburban design topics. And some of the programs that we've had have included downtown walking tours and community branding or creating community character within your suburbs. So again, we're excited to be co-hosting this event today. And I will switch it over to Brandon Nolan with Chicago Metro section.
Thank you, Tom. Waiting for a pop-up here. So yeah, Brandon Nolan, Director of APA Chicago Metro section. We're a section within the Illinois chapter. Just want to say thanks to our panelists today, and thanks to Tom for coordinating with us. MDRN has been a partner we've worked with for several years running now to do some great programs about kind of suburban design and best practices. And I'll keep it brief. I just want to plug a couple of upcoming events for us. We've got actually a kind of a coffee talk for our members coming up on the 9th with this panelist to kind of have some additional follow-up Q&A. We've got a Planners of Color happy hour on March 18th, also for members. And then if you're not a member of APA Illinois, because you're with the national audience here, we do have our state section conference coming up in mid-April on a couple Fridays there. So please check that out. You can go to our website, ilapa.org, to learn more, and that one's not restricted to members. So please do see if you'd be interested in taking part in those programs. But with that, I will hand it off to Brandon, who's going to start things off here.
Great. Thank you, Brandon. I'm going to go ahead and drop off my video here so everybody can see me. Or so everybody can see my screen, sorry. Fantastic. Here we go. All right, well, thank you, everyone. Great to be with you today. My name is Brandon Speck. I'm a director and market economist with the CoStar Group. For those of you not familiar, the CoStar Group is a collection of websites focused around the real estate industry. We serve as the unofficial MLS, if you will, for the commercial real estate industry, providing data analysis, property level financial tools to the data or to the commercial real estate industry. We're also the owner of apartments.com, as well as other apartment marketing platforms. And with that data, we're able to get a pretty good perspective as to what's going on in the commercial real estate market. So while we have a lot of planning experts today who will speak to you, my role is really just to be the wonky economist to kind of throw some data and charts your way to put some real numbers around the trends that we're seeing in the suburbs. So today we're going to just talk about suburban market trends, both pre and post-pandemic. And the reason I say pre and post-pandemic is because a lot of individuals are actually surprised to find out that even before the pandemic really accelerated this suburbanization trend we're going to talk about today, the suburbs were already growing at a faster clip than what was than the growth we were seeing in the city. So obviously, over the last decade or so, a lot of the talk relative to office employers, relative to millennials, has been this push towards urbanization, right? Major downtowns and major metro areas. We actually, though, have witnessed a pretty profound shift in growth rates between the suburbs and the cities that really, like I mentioned, predates the start of the pandemic, right? So when we talk about the suburbanization trend and the opportunity that lies ahead, let us remember this is an opportunity that really was unfolding before the pandemic started. Now, when we look at the metros across the country seeing the fastest growth relative to whether that growth is in the suburbs or whether that growth is in the city, you can see that the vast majority of cities are actually seeing both their cities and their suburbs grow, right? My top right quartile here in the green. But the fastest growing cities across the US are cities that are largely seeing their suburbs grow faster than their inner core. And when we look at this across regions, we see that this really does transpire across the regions of the United States. So whether you're looking at the Midwest, the Northeast, the West, or the South, all of which have very different employment dynamics and very different housing dynamics, we still see this same trend carry through, right? Where we're seeing metros largely seeing suburban growth outpace city growth. Now, it's important to understand where that growth is coming from. So when we look at the growth across age buckets, and what we're comparing here is just the growth since 2000 by age in millions. So how have we seen growth, population growth in large suburban areas change? How have we seen population growth in the urban core change going back to the year 2000? And what you'll notice scanning this chart is that every single age bucket, except 25 to 44-year-olds, saw more growth in suburban areas than within the urban core. Now that makes a lot of sense when we think about just the life cycle factors that drive a lot of 25 to really primarily 35-year-olds into the urban core. And now that's something that we've seen over the last decade, certainly, and it's something that we've seen at a faster clip simply just because this huge generation, right? The millennials, the largest generation in the history of the US, was pushing through their primary household formation years. They were taking on new employment, they were moving to new cities, they were leasing apartments primarily in the urban core due to entertainment, due to job location, and what have you. Now, let us think about this. We were pushing this pig through the python over the last 10 years, right? The python being the primary household formation years, the pig being this gigantic generation, right? But now what else do we know about life cycles? Generally speaking, as people age out of their 20s into their mid 30s, we tend to see this shift towards what? Suburban living. Right? Because now these individuals are no longer in their primary household formation years, they're in their primary family formation years. And this is something that we're going to see accelerate here over the next 10 years. It's something we've already been seeing take place over the last couple of years, but it's only going to accelerate. So if we look at a chart of aging the US population as of the year 2020, and we age it forward to 2030, and then we compare, okay, well, how will the respective age buckets change over those 10 years? What you can see is the biggest growth really is going to be in those primary family formation year millennials pushing into their 30s and their 40s, ages that, as you can see here, are largely, generally speaking, a life cycle change that occurs out in the suburbs, right? So this is a really demographic shift that even pre-pandemic was very supportive of suburban growth. Now, what we've seen since the pandemic for multiple reasons has been a really acceleration towards the suburbs. First and foremost, we've seen a huge uptick in home sales, right? There's been a couple different drivers of this. First and foremost, people are in their homes more now than ever. People are working from home. We're still seeing office occupancies, in the 20 to 30% as far as the percentage of employees coming in every day, right? Well, this has pushed people into their homes more now so than they've been in decades, right? A lot of entertainment places have been closed, restaurant activities been curtailed. All of this has really done a couple things. First and foremost, it's pushed people into their homes more, and it's also showed people that they likely either A, need more space, or B, because they're not going into the office as frequently, they can now move somewhere a little bit further out, get more space, and do so at a little bit of a cheaper rate. And so that really is pushing a trend towards home sales as well as towards the suburbs. So when we look at apartment demand changes across the units that CoStar is currently tracking, so CoStar is currently tracking over 30 million multifamily units throughout the US. And when we look at the estimated change in demand and we break that demand out between the suburbs and the city, as you can see here, when we look at demand in the suburbs for apartment units, now this is just market rate units, it doesn't include senior housing, student housing, affordable housing, this is just pure play market rate apartment units. What we see is a significant uptick coming out of the pandemic lockdowns out in the suburbs. So our black line there represents the average demand increase we've seen per month in the apartment market across the US, in the suburban apartment market. Now our orange bars there represent the demand change we actually saw in 2020. And as you can see, we saw about twice the amount of demand created in the suburbs from a units absorbed perspective, how many tenants were moving in versus moving out. So about twice as much net demand created in 2020 as we had seen over the prior 3 years. Now, this is certainly something that was largely driven by the pandemic, while the increase in home sales really was something that we saw ticking up pre-pandemic, but something that was certainly accelerated by some of the government programs that we saw put into place. Now, in conjunction with this shift out to the suburbs has been a pretty abrupt weakening within the CBDs across the US. So what I'm showing you here is just from a multifamily apartment asking rent perspective. What was the change in rents across various suburban and CBD metros? To the left, we have the best performing I'm sorry, to the left, we have the worst performing areas of the country, and to the right, we have the best performing areas. And I shaded them blue CBD, red suburban, so that your eyes could very quickly realize, wow, most of the worst performing areas are in the CBD, right? With the two exceptions being San Jose and San Francisco, probably the two most expensive suburbs in the entire country. Now, to the right side, we see the best performance or the best rent growth has largely happened in the suburbs. Now, obviously, rent growth is a proxy for demand or fundamental balance, right? Because at the end of the day, a landlord's ability to push rents is largely dependent upon the fundamental balance or leverage within that marketplace. So as we've seen more renters go out to the suburbs, we've seen rental growth really pick up out in our suburban areas. Now, shifting away from apartments and going to suburban office. So I've shown you charts that said population growth was already occurring in the suburbs. I've shown you charts that said it's now since accelerated from a home sales perspective and from an apartment demand perspective since the pandemic. Now, what about office? We haven't yet really seen that office demand flow back out to the suburbs yet, though we largely do believe it will. When we look at the suburban office market across the United States, it really still continues to be held back by just a significant amount of uncertainty, right? Employers are still very much wrapping their arms around their own business models, what their demand looks like from their customer base, as well as how much space they really need per employee. And we saw that uncertainty really weigh on both demand formation, as you can see on the top left, which is our net absorption in square foot. That's just a measure of the change in total demand over each quarter. So for example, in our current quarter, these are live numbers. So, through the first 65 days of the first quarter, we've seen about 25 million square feet of negative net absorption in the suburbs across the United States. Or said another way, about 25 million square feet of demand evaporate thus far. Looking back over the previous 3 quarters, you can see we were seeing negative demand in those quarters as well. Now, we're highlighting the suburbs here, but I can tell you these charts look just as bad in the CBD. So this isn't a suburban phenomenon. This is just current uncertainty in the suburban market, in the office market. We do very much strongly feel like what is actually being created right now is a lot of pent-up demand. You can see in our bottom left chart here, where we see that leasing activity has fallen off from about 60 to 70 million square feet per quarter down to 40 million square feet in the second quarter of the year, and really held around there through the rest of the year. Obviously, our Q1 number is to date, so we're going to see that lift through March. That uncertainty and that just pullback in leasing, we do feel is creating a lot of pent-up demand for employers once the uncertainty subsides, once we get vaccines into people's arms, and once they can wrap their heads around how much square feet they actually need to be occupying. With that loss in demand that you see in the top left corner, naturally we've seen an increase in the vacancy rate in suburban office properties across the country. So most recently, as of really the end of February, we saw the vacancy rate in suburban office fall around 9.5%. It's the highest level that we've seen since 2015, but it's also, as I mentioned, an upward trend that mirrors or is very similar to what we've seen in the CBD as well. And then finally, it's not all doom and gloom, because there are a lot of investors who I believe are starting to look past the pandemic, look towards a vaccine, and are seeing the opportunity, given the population flows out to the suburbs, are seeing the opportunities out in the suburbs. And we see that in our bottom right chart here, which is looking at the total amount of sales volume in suburban office properties per quarter. So CoStar tracked just a little under $12 billion of total suburban office sales that occurred in the country in the fourth quarter. And as you can see, a nice uptick from the really abrupt pullback in total activity that we saw occur in Q2 and Q3. So we feel like certainly investors are starting to take notice of the population flows, of other potential benefits to being out in the suburbs, such as greater parking, less reliance on public transportation, just an ability to allocate a greater amount of space per head just due to overall lower costs. We do feel like both investors and eventually tenants will take note of really those advantages that the suburbs are holding. Similar to what we saw in the office market, we did see a nice strong uptick in suburban land sales as well in the fourth quarter. So you can see a little over $20 billion of total land sales out in the suburbs in Q4, nearly twice the amount that we saw in either of Q2 or Q3. And also more than what we saw in Q1, which really most of Q1 occurred pre-pandemic. So a nice uptick. So similar to what we're seeing and expecting to occur in the existing office market, we're expecting to see more development going on in the suburbs, just based upon the fact that we're seeing population flows out to the suburbs. And at the end of the day, demographics are destined. Just a couple quick other points to hit on real quick. That certainly does impact just suburban land use as we think about it. First chart is just showing the abrupt uptick that we saw, which really started in March and April and held through the rest of the year in e-commerce sales relative to total retail sales. So you can see our red line here signifying as we saw this gradual increase over the last couple decades, but just that abrupt uptick up to about 17%. We've seen it since trickle back down, but really hold the line about 25% greater than what it was pre-pandemic. This has caused an explosion of industrial development, primarily out in the suburbs, and that's something that we certainly do expect to continue. It also is partly a cause for why we continue to see such a disrupted retail environment. While certainly the retail environment remains highly bifurcated, we do continue to see growth in suburbs, especially in fast growing metro areas like Dallas and in Denver and Austin and Phoenix, and areas where simply we're seeing population growth. While yes, the retail environment has certainly changed, it's still the old adage of retail following rooftops holds true today. Two more quick things I'm going to leave you with. Was just the impact that we've seen from government fiscal stimulus policies. And that's really been, despite what most would think going on in the pandemic, that's been an actual improvement in consumer balance sheets, which obviously are drivers of those retail sales and the overall economy. So first thing I'm going to show you is the personal savings rate, which a strong uptick in 2020 and really was part of the reason why we did see that uptick in home sales as well, as individuals who were saving money, who received stimulus checks, were able to use that money to go ahead and purchase a home when they had the income to do so. The other thing that we saw in the improvement in the average consumer was a drop in the household obligations ratio, or simply the amount of debt or the share of disposable personal income owed in debt. So again, 2020, despite the fact that we went through a pandemic and all signs were that things should be worse after losing millions of jobs across the economy, we actually saw an improvement in the average US consumer's financial picture. And that actually is what's caused part of this uptick in the home sales that we've seen and in this flight to the suburbs. So just a few final thoughts before I'll pass it over to Ralph. The aging of millennials into their primary family formation years was already driving growth in the suburbs, right? A trend, though, that is going to accelerate. At the end of the day, demographics are destiny in commercial real estate. The pandemic shifted where and how people use space, and really that placed a new premium on both in the home space as well as green space. The pandemic also shifted consumer spending habits, right, with significant implications for both retail and industrial sectors as we continue to see the e-commerce channels capture more and more consumer dollars. And then finally, the government support really did bolster consumer balance sheets, but also contributed to diverging fortunes in this K-shaped recovery we've been stuck with. And that's obviously creating significant winners and losers under the surface, despite the fact that we weren't able to actually get into those kind of individual metro levels performance today. So that's all I had for you. I appreciate everyone taking the time to listen, and I'm going to pass it over to Ralph.
So I'm unmuted and I'm looking for my, there we go. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So hi, my name is Ralph Zucker. I'm the president of Somerset Development. It's an honor to be here with all these great thinkers, and I really appreciate the invitation to participate. My company, Somerset Development, has developed over the last 20 plus years an expertise in reimagining the built environment. We're focused very much on creating great places for great people, and doing so utilizing tired, underappreciated, and underutilized assets. Oftentimes that involves sort of like trying to get a cat down from a tree, helping communities realize that the developers are not always so bad. And sometimes we have some good ideas and we actually mean well. It takes a while to get that across, but we've had, thankfully, quite a few successes. And I'm here to talk about one, Bell Works in New Jersey and Bell Works in Chicagoland, and use that a little bit as a window into what's going on in the suburbs today and how we see it actually. And Brandon, listening to you and seeing your metrics, you're spot on with a lot of what we're seeing actually in the field. Back in 2008, so the last large economic crisis, 2007, 2008, we had an opportunity to acquire Bell Labs, the former Bell Labs. You see that on the screen over here. A large 2 million square foot suburban vacant office park. So 2 million square feet, historic building, and it was really destined for demolition. Owned by Alcatel-Lucent, the owners and the community could not get together on the proper reuse of what was zoned as a single use building, office research, no residential, no retail, no nothing. And it was really tough to find a way to repopulate in the vacant suburbs. We walked into a market that had a vacancy rate hovering around 27, 30% for over a decade, maybe close to 2. And everybody had written off the suburbs. Suburban office was dead. And what do you do with this building? So what we realized, and I'll go through this quickly, and you can see over here, we say that everybody, I'm gonna turn off my camera so you can see. And hopefully I won't talk too much with my hands so you can see this. So we said at the time, everybody rolled their eyes. This is on the right, you can see a picture of Bell Labs, New Jersey, what it looked like. It was vacant, it was overgrown. The main picture you see is already after we did some work, but still a largely vacant building. And we were inspired by a quote by David Rockwell. And the quote went like this, I'll read it to you. What if the office became a place to live, create, play, research, entertain, connect, dine, incubate, film, broadcast, mentor, muse, learn, party, and invent? Great quote by a great architect. And it really inspired us very much to create what we now call the Metroburb, an urban hub, a little metropolis in suburbia. And while you look at Brandon's numbers and you look at all the data, at the end of the day, the data is just interpreting social trends and what we're all about. And humans are social animals. We want to cross-pollinate. We want to ideate. We want to meet different people. And one of the reasons that the urban cores grew so fastly and the suburbs were suffering was because it was just much easier in a way to have a great lifestyle in the city. The densities, the fact that there were human scale environments. Cities are not built as much for the garbage truck and the school bus and the fire truck as it tolerates them, and they have to walk through crowded streets with pedestrians. So our thought was, and we didn't know yet to call it a Metroburb, that's a word that we coined a little bit later on, but if we created a urban hub with urban cool, urban convenience, urban comfort in a great suburban location, we can have the best of both worlds. And we were seeing those trends that you heard about. We saw a reverse migration. We saw the baby boomers wanting to have their urban lifestyle, but still have it in a great suburban location. Place to park, a little bit of grass, school systems that may have been easier to access for children as they're raising families, and even a place to walk the dog. So all of these things, the trends, the ability of a great location came together for us, and we created what we believe is the world's first Metroburb, this metropolis in suburbia that we call Bellworks. We did it in a building designed by Eero Saarinen. I'm not going to focus too much on that. And the experience, the physical experience, definitely takes advantage of just a great streetscape that we have, open walkways, this huge pedestrian street that we call On the Blocks at Bellworks. And you can see over here in the graphic in the upper right, 2 million square feet. We're roughly the size of the Empire State Building, I think a little bit bigger, but you can walk anywhere. You don't even have to take the elevator. And that is another great factor in the post-pandemic world. Here's some shots of what life looks like on the block. And this is not just pre-pandemic, although I think these shots are mostly pre-pandemic, well, not all. But what's going on today? We have thousands of visitors, even though our offices are largely closed. We have thousands of visitors that come in to eat, to walk, to play into the block at Bellworks. And you can see there's a farmer's market. We had a farmer's market on before February 14th, pre-Valentine's Day, and there were over 3,000 visitors, all socially distanced because of the vast space, all indoors, all safe, and all, I hope, all happy. Some of the shops that you see. So what this does, it provides the urban streetscape. These are actual shops in spaces in Bellworks. The streetscape for a urban office style, but in a great suburban location. We could skip this. Here you can see also we focused a lot on bringing the outdoors in as well. We inherited a jungle on the left. We turned it into a little bit more of a curated space, as you see on the right. This quote does sum it up, that we have created a large-scale mixed-use environment, access to retail, entertainment, hospitality, health, wellness, fitness, everything you'd find in a great metropolis, but in a great suburban location. Add in some art, some music, and obviously some people, and you create a great place. So our experience, and I'll then go into Bellworks, Chicago, and our experience in New Jersey has been that if you build it, they will come. If you give, especially to the people, the millennials who grew up in a more urban environment and are migrating, we were able to tap into that desire, that reverse migration. Oh, and by the way, we gave people back 2-3 hours a day that they didn't have to commute once they moved to the suburbs to go back into the city to work. And we filled up a vacant building. We have 1.2 million square feet of office space to lease, and we've leased over 1 million square foot to date. And we're seeing a very strong demand even during a pandemic. And we're anticipating, as Brandon said, an overwhelming demand in a hopefully soon, post-pandemic world. Fast forward to Bellworks, Chicagoland. And actually, the history of this started with one of the people at the village of Hoffman Estates, where Bellworks, Chicagoland is. And I was giving a talk at an APA, national APA seminar about Bellworks, New Jersey. And I was giving it at the APA in New York. I believe it was 2017, if I remember correctly. May have been 16. Probably was 17. And Mark Coughlin stopped me after my talk. He says, Ralph, I have a building just like the one in New Jersey. And I rolled my eyes because I hear that probably 3 times a day, and it never is. But I said, next time I'm out in that area, I'll come out and take a look. And lo and behold, a few months later, I found myself walking through this amazing vacant edifice, 1.6 million square feet. You see it on the screen. Also a former telecom property, Meritech AT&T in Hoffman Estates, right on the 90, 15 minutes outside of O'Hare, a great suburban location. And we started working on creating the next Metroburb. Here's a floor plate, and I just wanted to put this on so you can understand and see the similarities between what you just saw in Bellworks, New Jersey. And I hope you can see my mouse moving, but you can see the light beige, and that is the real pedestrian street. Again, we call it On the Block at Bellworks. We're using the same language. We created a brand called Bellworks, and we have the block, we have the square. The light pink is the retail fronts, and then you see office, and it's a 3 to 4 story building. And the lines, so you have this block lined by retail, and we've already opened one half of the building. Here's some images of Bellwork Chicagoland. So we've been busy through the pandemic, and we created, you can see on the top left-hand corner, an image of part of the block. It's a huge space, same skylights. We took a space that really didn't look that great. It had great bones. Here on the, let's see if I can find this. I don't have it, a before photo. We do have it on our website though, if anybody wants to see it. And we gave it, again, an urban vibe. You could see the urban design. This is a cafe that's available to our, we have ready-to-wear suites. You see it on the bottom left. So again, tapping in, and the bottom right, tapping into the desire for people to have hub and spokes today in suburban locations. So you may have an office downtown, but you may want to have a suburban location near you, or smaller offices. People could come in and you can see these design suites. You can have them, you can walk in and in 5 minutes be inside a suite, as easy as leasing or renting a car, and you can give it back just as quickly. Here's some scenes from the building itself. You can see how it's coming together, and we've already welcomed our first 4 tenants. Thank you very much for that. If you could maybe show the, I'm going to pass over to Leslie, but beforehand, maybe you could show that video that we have that would just give a little bit. It's about 1 minute. Are you able to show the video? Oh, there we go. Okay, now I'm going to give it over to.
She's got it already. We are
she's
good
got
to
it.
go.
I got it.
Yep. Thank you, Ralph and Leslie.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. My name is Leslie Roth. I'm a principal with Lamar Johnson Collaborative in Chicago. We have 2 locations and are a firm that is under the Clayco enterprise. In-house, we have landscape architecture, and planning, and are really excited to share some of our experience and prior experience in the presentation with you today. So something I've been thinking about a lot in this post-pandemic world we're all living in is you've come a long way, baby. The way that we were thinking about, you can see from our other 2 presenters, where we were prior to the pandemic and where we are now, really has shown a lot of strength and resilience and ability to adapt to the changing times, both in our social and economic lives, as well as our physical environments. The words that you're seeing here begin to kind of illustrate a lot of the design thinking and how projects are being approached as we're moving towards a future, leaving the pandemic behind us. Many of the ideas around city planning, both of urban and suburban spaces, really focused on a different kind of design thinking than what we're seeing now. There's accelerating trends, as we've talked about earlier in the presentation, with our demography, with changing consumer behavior, with the way that we're using the office. And so being able to conceptualize spaces that are responsive, authentic, and embrace this new reality that we're all embarking on without having much practice at all is something that we're thinking a lot about in the architecture and design world. Over the last year, we've looked at ourselves in the mirror a lot. We've looked at each other in a different way. And there's been a lot of defining moments that have contributed to the way that we're thinking about the design of spaces and places that are resilient and responsive. So some of these defining moments, as you can see, are accelerating trends. We knew that population and changing demographics were trending towards the suburbs. The millennials that we all thought were going to stay in urbanized areas are making the same decisions that many older groups have. They're thinking about the suburbs as places that they want to live and raise families. There's a completely different atmosphere around public health, around the power of place, around our changing value systems, in political realignment. And also we're seeing opportunities for innovation that we didn't see before. We're seeing opportunities to reckon with our past and come up with creative and responsive ideas that represent who our best selves are. What does that impact look like, and what factors in the urban environment or in our physical environments are changing? One of those is transportation. Here in Chicago, we spend, we use our public transportation systems frequently. It's much easier to get around, it's low cost, and the region is relatively well connected. With the pandemic, people made a lot of different choices about their transportation methods, including riding bikes and walking more. I have a lot of friends that really struggled to find parts for their bike or even buy a bike for their kids, because that seemed to be the only way that we could connect with outside and each other through the pandemic. We've talked a lot about the different market sectors and how it's been impacted. The image that you see on the left here is the Mercy Medical Center that was built by Lamar Johnson and Clayco. And you can see that a lot of telehealth has been something that was on our radar before. A lot of us were not super comfortable with it, but because of the risk to safety and health, this has become part of our new normal, as everyone is saying. Our social environments are changing. The way that we relate to each other and connect to each other is changing. In urban planning and urban design, we're seeing a lot of different ways to connect through public engagement strategies and tools that we hadn't used before. And in at least several of the projects that we're working on, there's been a really robust turnout for public meetings, for workshops, for interviews, and for summits, because tuning in virtually is, people have realized, is a convenience. Jobs and employment, we talked a lot about also. Not all of our environments are created equally. However, when there's choice, what we're seeing is that people are finding ways to adapt and become resilient to these different opportunities. And lastly, health and wellness. And we'll get into what that means for our outdoor spaces and the design of suburban communities, and why this is a real advantage in areas with less density. In our work, and this is with a previous firm, this image is courtesy of Ratio. We did a lot of work looking at this layering of cities. What makes them work? What are the systems? How are things connected? And what is the value of open space when we look at urban and suburban areas in general? The four elements that you see here kind of rose to the top as priorities to begin to understand how to design spaces that were responsive coming out of the pandemic. There's a real scale shift between the community and the individual. Prior to the pandemic, we made choices on our own. This was something that we were used to doing, and spaces accommodated that. Post-pandemic, we're looking at the way that community can still flourish, where connections can still be made, but that we understand that some of those changes will be permanent. We're learning that environments need to be designed for adaptability and flexibility, and that repurposing of either underutilized land uses or spaces, or creation of new different kinds of spaces are going to be extremely important to be able to have successes coming out of the pandemic. And lastly, but of course not least important, is the idea of equity and defining what equity means when we look at the historic past of how some of our cities were formed, those that were either marginalized or disenfranchised, and how we can begin to think about solutions that are inclusive and address some of these issues in a healthy way for everyone to share in that privilege. So I'll give you some idea of what some of these design opportunities look like and what responsive placemaking can start to be. This is an idea that was submitted to the Chicago Architectural Foundation that looks at the future of transportation. Well, this is an urban image. We can think about transportation in a number of different ways and really begin to analyze the way that our roads, the function of our roads, and the place that they're going to have in our society in the future. Right now, a lot of freeways connect the suburbs, because we've never thought of the suburbs as part of the city. Suburban communities have demonstrated their value and worth, and also, as you could see from our last two panelists, these are spaces and places where people are prioritizing moving to, and the demographics of suburban communities are changing also. Along with those changes come changes to the transportation system, where not only public transportation, but bikes, pedestrians, and other multimodal systems are taking precedence. There's been a lot of news lately around EV and alternative energy means that affect the transportation system in communities, and we believe that suburban environments will also embrace some of these ideas to make getting around the communities and their connection to the city, if necessary, more efficient. This is an example of a suburban community outside of Chicago in Buffalo Grove. Buffalo Grove is lucky enough to have 2 commuter rail stations, and this particular commuter rail station is in an unincorporated part of Buffalo Grove that is primarily rural. Buffalo Grove was interested in understanding what the opportunities were with not only incorporating this area, but also creating a destination that could become a transit, that it fostered transit-oriented development. The rendering that you see here illustrates what that change can look like. And you notice that there are both areas that could potentially be retail commercial. It integrates housing. It's a similar scale to the context, but the noticeable changes are the enhancement of the public realm and the emphasis on the scale shift of creating different types of open spaces that could be used in a variety of ways to be responsive to our changing lifestyles. This rendering was actually created prior to, when the pandemic was just a twinkle in our eye, but the principles are similar. And as Brandon noted earlier in the presentation, that some of these trends were already starting to happen, were topics of conversation in the urban design and planning community. The pandemic has, of course, accelerated those. And so some of these ideas are still valid in creating resilient communities that will continue to have value as population growth occurs. This is another rendering of a similar idea, where the emphasis is placed on the public realm, on connectivity of trail systems, on enhanced open spaces, and multi-use paths that de-emphasize the car and really place an emphasis and prioritize a walkable district that is accessible to all. This is a project done recently by Lamar Johnson Collaborative in a suburb of St. Louis in Chesterfield. This is a very interesting development that similarly embodies the ideas that Ralph was talking about with the Metroburb. It also considers a walkable community that has access to jobs and employment, that has an enhanced public realm with outdoor space, and also has a residential component also. This was a defunct area, underutilized, kind of on the outskirts that had not a lot of connectivity to the city of St. Louis. But the idea here is that some of the changes and decisions that we've made throughout the pandemic will be permanent. That while all suburbs are not created equal, that some of these best practices of realizing that people have higher expectations for their environments, and also are really looking for opportunities to have convenience be at their fingertips, but have a rich, full life that is fully amenitized, are manifested in developments like this. It's a relatively large development, and you can see that there is, the smooth transition between some of the retail and commercial uses, the office uses, and then of course the residential component. This is a development that we're working on in Chicago. However, the ideas that this project particularly embodies are looking at opportunities for infill spaces and our emphasis on what outside means. There's nothing like taking a walk around the neighborhood now. It never felt so good to be out of the house as during a pandemic. This is the idea that we're thinking about outdoor spaces, infill spaces, and those little patches that you walk by every day that don't have any programming, to actually think about what that looks like and how it adds value to our lives. So in looking at other past post-pandemic best practices, adaptive reuse is another one of those, and really thinking about how these spaces can be flexible and adapt to change. One of the market sectors that we didn't talk a lot about today is the bar and restaurant industry that has been, really put in a position to have to change not only their business models, but how they relate to their customers throughout this crisis. And using outdoor space, I'm sure all of you have seen some of the tents and other really creative ways to get people into their businesses in a safe way. Similarly with pop courts, this is a way that community can come together and still feel that connection, but emphasizing the power of place and the power of being outside. Another best practice that we thought a lot about is, what does the street mean? Prior to the pandemic, we used streets sometimes for outdoor cafes, but we never really thought about closing down streets or the multitude of uses that streets could have besides moving traffic and besides being places where loading could happen. So this idea talks about a whole variety of uses that can be flexible, where the right-of-way between buildings can be used for a whole variety of uses that we never thought of before. And because of this pandemic, some of these changes, will be permanent. We've kind of gotten used to eating outside. We've gotten used to, doing our normal everyday life in a different kind of way. And so this is actually a really wonderful thing, to be able to evaluate how we use that 60, 100 feet of right-of-way in ways that could be more productive, seasonal, and used in different ways throughout the year. These two slides, this slide shows you two ideas of, on the left, an existing condition of a street, and on the right, how this could be partitioned, potentially closed off, potentially changed seasonally to adapt to the needs of people on the street, to visitors coming to the area, and using some of the program flexibility, that this could be a new destination in communities. Suburban communities can, while this is this is on an urban street, suburban communities can also take advantage of some of these ideas by evaluating how streets are used, looking at office trends, lighter commutes, and being able to offer residents of suburban communities greater amenity in their own neighborhoods. Again, this is a section showing a similar idea of looking at how people can still feel connected and infuse kind of their own imprint on their communities. So just a few ideas about how urban design and land use have adapted during this post-pandemic atmosphere, and really beginning to think about what trend acceleration means for our physical environments. The examples I gave today are specifically Chicago centric. However, in the trends that we've looked at today, there is a national trend towards some of these same best practices, including walkability and feeling connected. There's also an idea of suburban communities kind of being empowered to infuse culture and history into these spaces to create a really vibrant and lasting setting. Thank you.
Great, thank you. If everyone wants to throw their webcams back on, we can jump into some Q&A here. As a reminder, folks, if you have questions, just type them in the chat box in your GoToWebinar tool panel. We're going to start off with a few kind of pre-populated questions, and then we'll jump in with the remainder of the time with some questions from our attendees. So let's see, this first question here. How can suburban communities respond to the pandemic in a resilient way? Who would like to kick that off? Leslie, maybe we'll start with you since you most recently spoke on that.
Sure. I think this is a really exciting time for suburban communities. We've all, slowed down a little bit and had time to assess our values and what makes the spaces in our communities important. I think it is, this is a great time for suburban communities really to take inventory of their assets and their strengths and really begin to understand what you want to build on, because you have time and you have choice right now. We know that some suburban communities have not developed probably as desirably as leadership and stakeholders would have liked. And now's a really great time to take that inventory and be able to make different decisions about land use and how you can create environments that are resilient and are responsive to the changing demographics and age groups of your community. In suburban communities that we've worked in outside of Chicago, we found that there is a growing population of both millennials who, like the idea of affordability in the suburbs. While there may not be jobs, if they are close to a train line, it's a real amenity for them. We've also found that for folks who have families, because of the changing nature of employment and the possibility of better schooling in the suburbs, that this is another amenity that suburbs can leverage. So I think in the future, moving into the future, that suburban communities who are able to, assess who they really are and kind of do some introspection on what their strengths are and leverage those both in what they provide for their residents and stakeholders, and also the type of physical spaces that they're designing or prioritize would be one way to continue to be resilient.
If I could just add to what Leslie just said, I think that was very well said. The fact is that none of that's going to happen unless the suburbanites, the people who live there, don't get the message to their elected officials and community leaders that the time has come to throw out the archaic land planning guidebooks and zoning, exclusionary zoning and discriminatory zoning, all the different things that are designed to keep us segregated apart, whether we're segregated by economic income or the milk is here and the office is there and the newspaper is there. All of these things are archaic. Communities, life is too short. Speaking as a developer, life is too short to battle the constant, to go ahead and do. There are great ideas. We've heard exactly what we need, but today to take that into a suburban community and try to get it through the approval process can take you between 5 and 10 years. We'll be in the next crisis, hopefully not, but probably. So the answer is we have to empower our leadership and tell them, don't be scared of us, because this is really what we want.
Yeah, and just one last thing I would add is the suburbs are getting a fresh look, right? And we learned that in a lot of ways they already were, but there is now a whole new generation of individuals taking a look at the suburbs for the very first time, right? So market yourself to that generation, understand what that generation's looking for. We heard it, right? It's mass transit, it's walkability, it's connection. right? Connection to the physical space, connection to other people. But the suburbs have a wonderful opportunity in the fact that right now we're still seeing people largely trying to shutter overly dense areas, right? There's a density penalty right now that we're witnessing in our data. And that's a great opportunity for those suburbs who can market themselves to that next generation of potential residents and taxpayers, right? Which will allow the continued growth of the area. So.
And we'll finish up the COVID conversation here with one last question, and this is for you, Ralph. Actually, this came in about half a dozen times from our attendees, so I just wanted to throw it in here. Could you talk about the HVAC system, and is there anything special that has been done in light of COVID with all of that space, communal space, particularly in the Bellworks projects?
Sure,
and how
absolutely.
you've just addressed all that?
Sure. So love the question. And the fact of the matter is that it's more relevant in New Jersey because New Jersey has, as I said, thousands of people here daily. How do we keep them safe? So I'll try to say this very quickly. We partnered with the largest healthcare system in New Jersey, Hackensack Meridian, and we invited them in to sort of give us adult and scientific supervision, medical supervision over our protocols. Our management, our design team, worked literally around the clock to create not just the graphics, but the graphics in a cool and inviting way that doesn't say danger, but says stay apart. And if you look at our website, you'll see some of those great images. The HVAC system in particular, we did a few things. First of all, we increased in both locations, we increased the amount of fresh air. Boosted it up by recommendation to 25% as a minimum. So the fresh air coming into the building, a lot of buildings are designed because of green certifications. They're sort of designed to be hermetically sealed. You heat the air and cool the air once a season, and then you just try to keep the same air circulating. Very unhealthy. And you know, in 1 year, you went from wanting to hermetically seal your building to wanting to open it up as much as possible. So we brought in a minimum of 25% outside air, fresh air. It is more expensive. You have to heat it and cool it, but it's much safer. We've also changed the filters to MERV. I'm not the scientist, but MERV rated filters, HEPA filters, as well as we're now in the process of putting in some type of ionizers. And again, I'm not the guy who could talk about this, but something that sort of zaps every particulate that comes through. We looked at different lights as well that are supposed to do the same thing, but they're very inefficient in large HVAC systems. So we're in the process of installing ionizers as well. We've also distributed throughout the building different air cleaners. And then our design team, again, focused a lot on biophilic design, brought in a lot. We brought in a lot of just more outside plants, and we installed trees. It was planned, but we accelerated it because of the pandemic. So we have literally 2 indoor gardens of, I think, 36 trees in total, plus plants everywhere to help cleanse the air. So a lot more detail to that, but overall, and we also try to make sure that whoever comes in here is healthy. So anybody who walks into Bellworks in Chicago, it's the beginnings. In Chicagoland, it's a smaller amount, so it's temperatures taken manually. But in New Jersey, we have thousands of people coming in daily. Any entrance has automatic cameras that take your temperature and tell us if you're wearing a mask, if you're wearing it properly, and we monitor that as well.
All right. Wow. Okay. Next question. We're looking for some examples of successful developments or urban planning projects in suburban communities. And I'll tell you, when someone puts projects, new development or projects in suburban together, my initial reaction is to picture kind of a utopian new urbanist sort of situation. That's immediately where my brain goes. Is that really the case? Or, you know, what are some good projects that you've all seen in suburban communities develop, and what do they look like?
They look like Bellworks.
The suburban developments that I've seen are, you know, similar to the one in Wildwood, Missouri, example that I showed outside of St. Louis, that there seems to be more of an emphasis on creating a complete community. I wouldn't necessarily call it utopian, but there's less emphasis on driving between places within, you know, a district or within the community, and more of an emphasis placed on, you know, understanding all of those potential kind of mobility options. And there is an emphasis on open space. I think that there's a real, people really underestimate the value of parks, parklets, connectivity to bike trails, bike lanes on roads. You know, this is actually incredibly valuable. And also creating, you know, opportunities for, you know, just for discovery. So those ways of connecting communities, and also having them be highly amenitized, so that you don't necessarily need to, you know, have your house right next to a business, but having a business that is reasonably close by, that's some kind of convenience commercial, is also very important. And allowing for housing choice and diversity of housing type. Those are the other developments that I have seen that are successful, where, you know, not everybody wants a, you know, 3,000 square foot single family home and the maintenance that comes with living on a half acre. You know, that's not something that everybody wants that's moving to the suburbs. Particularly, you know, as Brandon pointed out, if you're moving from an urban area, you know, you maybe don't want all that maintenance, but you just want more space, and you want some of the convenience of living in an urban area, but without the level of density. And so the most successful developments kind of look urban light, and have some choice, as opposed to being disconnected. And you know, along the new urbanist transect, you know, fewer of them are closer to rural.
Yeah, I think I couldn't say it any better than both Ralph and Leslie already said it, but open spaces, certainly connectivity. They kind of work, live, play dynamic, right? All in one, with a diversity of housing between condos, townhomes, for rent apartments, and single family homes are, I think, the ones that we've seen really take off and be most successful, because they do kind of provide a bit of everything, right? That people are looking for. They want fresh air, they want lighting, they want open space, they want green spaces, but then they also don't want the inconveniences that oftentimes comes with those amenities, right? So it's bringing, bridging the gap between the inconveniences of the amenities that they want and the things they actually need. One example that comes to mind right off the top of my head here in Chicago in the suburbs would be the Glen, right out in Glen Ellen, a wildly successful mixed-use development with retail, housing, office space. Not a ton of office, but it's a space that incorporates parks and fountains and retail, and a diverse retail set that provides both services as well as dining, and those types of developments that can, I would say, bridge the gap between what people want and what people need, and the friction between the two of those are going to be the most successful.
Yeah, if I could just add on that to what you both said. The fact of the matter is that suburban communities have to learn. Like, you know, Leslie said, not everybody needs a half acre or even an acre or 2 acres or 5 acres in a 5,000 square foot house. The zoning laws have to change to allow for properly designed row houses, townhouses, multifamily with open space, a small pocket park perfectly placed, a great little alleyway behind a townhouse community. Instead, we force people to build townhomes and parking lots and disconnected from everything. And then the park is 3 miles away and have to get into your car to drive to it. So, you know, you mentioned new urbanism, and the new urbanists have the playbook, and they have the whole transect and how to get it done. And communities really need to plan for this. And the problem is not that the ideas aren't out there. Everybody knows what we have to do. We have to change the codes to allow it.
Wonderful. Let's talk about millennials. There's a lot of questions about these guys. So what do we do to prepare for them? How can suburban communities leverage them moving into the communities? Can we assume that millennials will just sort of morph into the current landscape, or are they going to have a heavy hand in saying, you know, if it's not what we want, we're out? Let's talk about it.
Yeah, to being probably the only millennial here, maybe I'll start with that. You know, but I'm also, maybe I'm the perfect millennial because I'm a millennial with four children, expecting my fifth actually next week. So I've lived in the suburbs, owned my own home for many years, despite the fact that I'm a millennial, right? I'm the front end of the avocado toast, if you will. Millennials at the end of the day, being an older millennial who's raising children, you do kind of morph into the same patterns that prior generations did, right? We want parks for our kids, we want good schools, right? But the one difference is still being somewhat young, you also want to have a place where you can go get a good bite to eat, place where you can have a little bit of nightlife. I need to get on a train to get to the city of Chicago because that's where my job is. So I think providing, to the extent that you can bring walkability, bring entertainment to, and bring some source of excitement to your community, while also still providing the bedrock of suburban communities like good schools and parks and housing choice and relatively affordable, you know, good quality housing. At the end of the day, again, I think it's kind of a mix of both, right? It's providing those things that the millennial generation are looking for, just like every generation before us, while still also appealing to that little bit inside them that still wants to go, you know, listen to some live music until 12 in the morning, right? That part's dying in us, but there's still a little bit there, and you can still tap into that and capture some excitement that way.
I mean, we always talk about millennials because it's an extremely large cohort of people, and that there is potentially a lot of influence in, you know, what this cohort can do. But some of the habits are different. You know, there's this interest in the sharing economy where, you know, for many millennials, there's either not a lot of cash or not a lot of interest in really committing to, you know, taking the path that Brandon did, buying a house in the suburbs, you know, really committing to that. And there's been a lot of technology and other responses to what the sharing economy means, Uber, Lyft, you know, rent a dog, you know, et cetera, that kind of cater to not necessarily needing to make a full commitment. However, millennials do have a very strong value system. And so a lot of brands have even shifted their marketing to be able to put mission first, you know, because this is the thing that millennials are buying into. And so for municipalities to be able to attract millennials, having an authentic identity that you can share is one way to leverage that and attract them. When we were working in Buffalo Grove, we talked to a number of young people, single millennials who lived in Buffalo Grove, which is, you know, it's about 45 minutes away from Chicago by commuter train. It's not close. And they were teachers in the city of Chicago or in, you know, neighboring suburbs, and they wanted to live in Buffalo Grove because housing was less expensive. But they also said that there weren't enough options. There weren't enough rental units. The rental units that they had to choose from were aging. And so having that diversity of housing choice so that you can attract millennials when, you know, they are single, when they get out of college, and then give them an option to stay there and raise a family, you know, and also to age in your suburbs, because seniors also require a different, you know, desire a different kind of living situation. So if there's that unique experience and authentic identity, and if there is choice with the way that they can move through their lives as they age and the different choices that they'll have to make, then and you're amenitizing the communities and providing opportunities for connection, that's, you know, those are also some of the ideas that and trends that we're seeing with millennials and how they make decisions.
Yeah, and if I could add just one more thing to what Leslie said too, I think we oftentimes, as necessary, talk about large groups of people as if there's some homogenous blob all moving in the same direction, right? Really, as I've lived it and as I've seen it, I've always explained millennials as four really distinct groups, right? You have older millennials and younger millennials. Let us remember the oldest millennials are 39 years old. Right, they're almost in their 40s, right? So certainly they're not beanies and avocado toast anymore. You have your younger millennials all the way to the age of 25. There is a significant difference between the values and the views on the world from your 39-year-old millennials who look more like, quite frankly, Gen X, and your 25-year-old millennials who look more like Gen Z, and I think share a lot more of the characteristics that Leslie's talking about. The other thing that you have to remember about millennials is we came of age. I graduated undergrad in 2009, right in the midst of the worst financial crisis in the history. I was fortunate. I got a commercial banking job. It launched my career, and everything's been rosy ever since. A lot of my friends who went to college and did everything right, graduated in 2009, languished in retail jobs for 5 years, never had that career take off, and they've had a completely different life trajectory than I, right? So we do have almost that same K-shaped recovery that we're seeing play out in the economy, we have in the millennial generation. So millennials are very diverse, and they're both older and younger, as well as more affluent and less affluent, and they're each kind of looking for different things, I think.
Okay. Next question. I'm fusing a couple together here. Let's talk about tenant demands and how they have shifted over the last year. And the question is, what amenities and services are we now prioritizing? And so for a little bit of this context here, let's narrow in first on the future of entertainment uses like movie theaters, arts venues, places where people gather in larger quantities, where the past year they've been closed and somehow life is still going on. Will these places reopen? Are we going to come back and try to prioritize them as this whole live, work, play space, or is there just going to be a whole new priority? Let's talk through that.
So I can take a stab at that, since we're managing spaces daily. And I'll start with tenants, talking about office tenants, and then go into what you were asking about theaters and restaurants and things like that. In general, we have office users from one desk in our CoLab, which is our co-working space, all the way up to 350,000 square foot large tenants. And we find that the more entrepreneurial you are, and the smaller the office, the more people are coming back. And those people are demanding and, looking for safety. They have to come to the office. They got to get out of the house to get to work. They're not really necessarily even pulling in a paycheck from somebody else. And yet they need a safe environment. So they're looking for everything from an office that's properly disinfected twice a day. They want to know that the elevator button is going to be wiped down periodically, hand sanitizers put out, proper distancing, that everybody who walks in, as I mentioned earlier, is vetted in terms of being safe and properly masked. They want that safety and security, so they need to show up. They have a need to be there, but yet there's I don't want to say a fear factor, but there's definitely a desire to provide. Every table in our common area has a thing on it: clean or not clean. When you're finished, you turn it over. We have increased our cleaning staff because of that. So all of these things are simple things, but very, very necessary. They want private entrances so they can get in without walking past people who are not necessarily tenants. And then once you get into the areas of entertainment, we have many entertainment venues at Bell Works. Virtual reality, virtual golf, escapology, which is a type of escape the room. We have movies. We spent a summer with outdoor movies that started out in our parking lot. Huge, like typical drive-in movies back in the 60s and 70s. It came back in a big way all across the country. We had hundreds of people nightly. And then as it got colder, we actually brought it inside, but we had to social distance. So we have movies in our auditorium, but instead of having 300 people, I believe we may have only 25 people distance. Restaurants are serving out into the common area, into the spaces that are properly ventilated and where you could socially distance. So there's a huge yearning on behalf of people to get back to life. People are looking for safe ways to do it. You can come to Bell Works and get a cup of coffee, but you won't be able to drink it inside the coffee shop. You'll be able to drink it outside on the block in the atrium. So tenants are looking for that. People from the street, from the common realm, from the neighborhood are looking for Main Street to come back. And as we learn how to properly ventilate and properly disinfect and properly distance, you'll see things coming back slowly but surely.
Anyone else?
My only 2 cents would say we were seeing enormous growth in how American consumers were shifting their spend towards really entertainment, whether that be eating out at restaurants and bars, whether that be traveling, whether that be going to games, movies. Pre-pandemic, we were seeing explosive growth in those figures. Actually, in 2019, I think was the first year we saw consumers spend more money at restaurants than they did at grocery stores. So I don't think that is going to shift once people feel confident in returning and being in close places. The only caveat I would throw out is just that movie theaters are likely, just due to the direct release streaming, are likely to be changed forever. Demand for movie theaters. But outside of that, I think they want to be entertained and to congregate in spaces. If anything, I think we're going to see pent up demand for it. Consumers with a little more money in their pockets, and actually a really strong bounce back once we get more vaccines and once people feel confident doing it.
And of course, the availability of outdoor spaces to accommodate these restaurants and people is huge.
Absolutely.
Let's take a shift and talk about housing. Again, I'm gonna kind of fuse a couple questions together. One question is sort of getting at the eviction crisis that we're starting to face with the pandemic. And it happens everywhere, not just in urban centers, it happens out in the suburbs too. So if we could comment about that specifically. I know, Brandon, I think you all made mention actually of just the need for more housing across the board. And if we could shed some light on affordable housing in the suburbs and what can be done to help that process, to change those codes to make affordable housing easier and worthwhile for the communities. So if we could tackle some of those items.
Absolutely. Maybe I'll kick it off first. So there was a lot packaged there. I apologize. What was the very first part?
Oh
no.
the eviction crisis. Let's talk about
Thank you very much. So really, there's a crisis of payment across the board, right? Because the eviction crisis is born from a significant loss of jobs throughout our economy, primarily on the lower end of the skills ladder and primarily frontline service sector jobs. And those individuals haven't been able to pay their rent, but those landlords then aren't able to pay their mortgage, right? So it does certainly work all the way up the system. It's likely going to require federal help, quite frankly, because it's just such an enormous problem at this point. So really, there's two portions of it. It's the for rent, and then there's also the for sale, right? Because we have millions of Americans who are also currently utilizing some type of forbearance program. I think it was like over 3 million last I saw. That to me is a little bit less of a concern. And the big reason is because they've now since announced programs where individuals who are even 12 months late on their mortgage can effectively tack that onto the end of their mortgage, no strings attached. It's just an additional lien. You're up on your escrow, you're completely good to go. So as long as you can start making your payments again, as long as your employment hasn't been permanently impacted, those individuals should largely be fine due to those government programs. The federal government's going to have to step in and find a way to bridge the gap between landlords and renters. It's just become too big of a problem for really any state, any local agency to really make too much of a dent in the problem. Regarding just housing supply, we've woefully underbuilt in the last decade. Naturally, a lot of our home builders went bust. We saw construction go to zero effectively after the great financial crisis. And unfortunately, coming out of the great financial crisis, we saw the millennials come of age and start creating 1.2 to 1.4 million households a year, right? An explosion of growth in just the number of households because millennials were creating their own households now. So it's created this huge gap and a lot of pricing pressure. And unfortunately, unless we really want to go through, I think, some really painful house pricing increases, some really painful rent increases in the apartment sector, and all but really the Class A downtown that we've probably overbuilt now, we're going to have to see some type of private-public partnership is really what it's going to have to take. It's going to take, again, the federal government likely putting a lot of money at the issue, because the private sector, especially when you start talking affordable housing, isn't necessarily going to be economically motivated enough to, or even able to solve the problem without government sweeteners and without the government helping along. So I do think it is going to take partnerships between private entities and the government, who government can't go out and build and manage 1 million units. Right? We've seen them try and manage housing, and it doesn't go well. So we need the private sector, but we need the backing of the public sector. And how they're going to marriage the two, quite frankly, will take someone far smarter than I.
If I could gently jump in and disagree with you, Brandon, on what you just said about the need for government to bridge the gap in terms of affordable housing and building more. I think government actually has to do something called get out of the way. The private sector is strong. The home building sector, the ability to build as much as is necessary, and including affordable housing and inclusionary housing, is robust and available. The problem is government does two things. They restrict your ability. They say, oh, you can only build 5-acre lots over here. That costs so much money that prices people out of the marketplace. When if you have a mile of roadway, and that mile of roadway has 5 homes on it, or it has 50 homes on it, it's a huge difference. So by creating this imaginary zoning to protect our way of life that says, we don't want to change the character of our town, and we're really putting barriers to everybody. Every strata of every economic income is being stressed by that, and the people that are being hurt the most are at the lower part of the economic ladder. But the fact of the matter is that if communities would just allow bonus densities, they would just say, you know, this is zoned for 1 house per 1 acre, but if you build 10 or 15% affordable, we'll give you a bonus density to more than compensate for that. The government would not have to write 1 check for $1, and you would see affordable housing fly up all across communities. So the problem is, in many, many states, decisions on zoning are made locally and not made by the states, and not necessarily even by the counties that govern them. And yet, so everybody wants affordable housing in the next community. They don't allow it there. The people in power fight for their way of life or perceived way of life and are putting those barriers. And really what we've done in the United States, in most states, is we've taken the affordable housing crisis, and we've put it on, not on the shoulders of government, we've put it on the shoulders of the people who are the middle income Americans, who are saying, okay, in order for my developer to go ahead and build a house for me, they have to build a quarter of a house affordable, or 10% of that house in an affordable community. Well, they're just going to pass that cost on to the consumer who's paying. It doesn't come out of the developer's pockets, I can guarantee you that. It just comes out of the next strata of the consumer. So the government has created these barriers, and then they want to be, it's like putting up a toll booth and saying, pay me to get through. The government could get out of the way and solve this with no infusion of money.
So, and I know it's a little after 2:30, so I want to respect everyone's time. I feel like we hit a hot button and we need to dig into this further, because I know I alone have like 10 more questions for all of you regarding now this housing, and Ralph, I think offline you're about to get an email from me with 10 more questions. So I think we have ourselves another webcast topic here, particularly on how ways in which we clearly need to infuse affordable housing into our zoning legislation and all of that, and the best way in which to do that.
Also clarifying if we're talking about attainable affordable housing based on income level of the community, or if we're talking about government subsidies when we talk about affordable housing. So
Sure.
they're very different things.
Right. I think this is a to be continued. We're not done here. This was really great. I appreciate all of you for coming on and for APA Illinois and their partners for joining us today. We are recording this session so you can share it with your friends. We'll post it up onto our YouTube channel. Just search Planning Webcast and it will pop up. We'll also have a PDF copy of the slides available. Brandon, if you could just send me yours real quick when you get a moment.
You should have them. I sent them right before.
Oh,
Always at
you
the
did?
last minute.
Okay, I'm sure I do then. We'll have those posted shortly on our webcast webpage, ohioplanning.org/planning webcast. Everyone, thanks again. This was great. We'll see everyone next time. Don't forget to register for our upcoming sessions. And everyone have a great weekend.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.